This is part 2 in our guide to analysing context, and in this video we're doing a deep dive into tenor. Tenor describes the level of relationship that exists between the creator of a text and the audience. The key question to ask is, what kind of relational elements are present within this text? This video will look at 3 general criteria that you can use to assess the tenor of a text: personal address, interactive and engagement elements, and objectivity and passivity. When we think about tenor, we're thinking about a line between casual language and formal language, and recognizing the difference that exists between those 2 points. When analyzing something for tenor, the first question to ask is whether the creator of the text is directly relating to the audience. We're looking for evidence of self-expression, where the writer is describing themselves as I, me, or my, a direct address to the audience, where they're using words like you, your, or your, and inclusive pronouns like we or us. These forms of language create a relationship as though someone's speaking directly to us. For our sample text, we're looking at this extract from reduce, reuse, and recycle. When it comes to looking at tenor, the first and easiest thing to look for is the existence of personal pronouns. In this text, I can see the use of the word we and our, which is that inclusive pronouns, which suggests the creation of a relationship. The writer did not have to use that language. They could have written it in a more passive view, but they've made the choice to use words like we and us and our in order to make it feel as though we are alongside them, and that builds relationship. We can also see the use of words like you and your, where there's a direct address to the audience. Now, in a conversational tone, we're not always expecting someone to reply, but if I'm speaking to you or addressing you as a particular entity that happens to be reading my writing, then I'm acknowledging that you exist, which is a form of relationship. So any use of personal pronouns is always an indication of a more casual form of communication. It's relatively simple to describe whether or not something has personal pronouns, but just because it doesn't say I, me, you, or us doesn't mean that it doesn't have relational elements to it. So in the case we find a text that doesn't have those clear indicators, here's some tips of what you can look for. Interactive and engagement elements are the ways that a writer might try and interact with us in a more passive way. So let's look at some examples of this in a text. If you look closely at this text, you'll see that I've edited it from the previous version to remove that personal language. On a simple level, we might now say that because there's no personal pronouns, it's therefore incredibly formal, but that's where understanding this type of evidence becomes really important. Let me show you some examples. This text uses language to exaggerate information to the audience. We see it in the use of the exclamation point when they say it's actually recyclable. We also see it when they say it's super important. They could have just said it's important, but they've decided to put in that extra word super to really exaggerate. Now, what this tells us is that the person who's writing is not just thinking about communicating information. They want us to understand which information is really important and why. That type of writing suggests that they are thinking of us as the reader while they're writing it, and that creates a relationship even if they don't directly address us. We can also see examples of interaction where they're not using personal pronouns. When they say avoid throwing things away altogether, they're talking to us. They haven't used the word you in this case, as in you should avoid throwing things away. But when we read it, we recognize that they are talking to us. So there is an interactive element even though there's not a personal pronoun. In the same way, you can see that I've edited the rhetorical question, which originally had a personal pronoun in it. In this case, it says, how else can waste be reduced? I wanted you to see an example of a rhetorical question that does not use personal pronouns, because this still counts as interactive and engaging elements. The writer obviously wants us to be thinking about this topic, and they've prompted us to do it, which shows they're thinking about us, which indicates relationship. The third element here is the hardest to spot, but it does indicate elements of relationship despite the fact that there might not be personal pronouns and there might not be interactive language. As a general point of reference, something that's really formal is purely about conveying information. A really formal sentence might be, World War I began in 1914. In this case, there's a high degree of certainty in saying it as a fact. The other key thing is I'm describing the event. I'm not describing who started it or who was involved. We call this the difference between high modality and passive description versus lower modality and active description. It sounds pretty complex, but let's look at some examples. Here's some really subtle indications of relationship. The first example talks about each year every house in the UK produces about 1 tonne of waste. This is what we call active language because it puts the focus of the sentence on who is producing the waste, and that creates an element of humanity and relationship. A more formal way to say this would be each year 1 tonne of waste is produced within UK households. What this does is it takes the idea that the people in the house are not the people who are producing the waste, and it shifts the focus into the fact that the waste is being created. It's a subtle difference, but the acknowledgement of the fact that the tonne of waste is contributed to by people is a more casual and relational approach than involves focusing purely on facts. A similar example here is when we use opinion. When I gave you the example that World War I began in 1914, there was no element of opinion to that. Now, I could make that communication more casual, and I could say, I think that World War I began in 1914. What I've done there is showed that I am less certain about what I'm saying, and therefore I'm more casual and relatable. I also used a personal pronoun in there as well, if you didn't pick that up. Look at this sentence. It's super important to check the label on every piece of rubbish. Now, the way that that's been written in this case is an opinion. Someone having to convince us that it's important means that they're trying to convince us that it's more important than something else. If I wanted to formalize this and also bring in some more passive language, I could say the label on every piece of rubbish is checked. Based on all of the elements I've identified, I would say that this piece is quite casual. My justification in this case is that the text directly addresses the audience using terms like you and uses inclusive language such as we or us to create a relationship. But it's not just that. The text also interacts with the audience. It poses rhetorical questions and it directs the audience to avoid throwing things away. The text also uses active language to convey information, and it often presents information as opinion rather than fact. As a final point to these videos, I like to address the criteria by which we determine whether someone has a good understanding of context. In this case, being able to show different reasons why something might be more casual demonstrates comprehensive analysis, and it draws on the language of each area of tenor with consistent accuracy.